Put the kettle on, I am coming home. Pokémon Gold and Pokémon Silver. The second generation of Pokémon games. A direct follow-up / sequel to the first entries Red and Blue. There was a lot of anticipation for these games after the wild success of the Generation 1 titles. Well, I was very young at the time. I was just an excited little boy. But I remember seeing the ads for these games and salivating at how cool they looked. In full colour, with updated, lively looking sprites. And sprites my eyes could actually decipher. I'm looking at you, Venusaur back sprite. That was a mess. I put a lot of hours into the Johto region as a kid. And now I'm back to put in a few more, as we take a retrospective walk through Pokémon Gold and Silver. The games begin quite similarly to how Red and Blue do, taking our first steps into the open by running an errand for the Professor. Whether that's an intentional thing to spark some instant familiarity for returning players, that's up for debate. To keep us safe while we run that errand, we are given our first Pokémon by Professor Elm. The choices being Chikorita, Cyndaquil, and Totodile. And look, all three of these Pokémon are great, but there are unfortunately advantages to picking some over the others. I'm mainly talking about Chikorita here. Most of the gyms in these games are either super effective or resistant to Chikorita's grass typing, and so it's been done dirty in a lot of ways, and is definitely the least popular starter choice. But you know what? I love Chikorita, so I chose it here. Out of pure spite for the system that's trying to pull it down. To be honest, it's only really an issue if you're one of those people who tries to steamroll the games with just your starter Pokemon, which for full disclosure, I was totally one of those players as a kid. But if you're a half-decent Pokemon trainer, you'll be fine. Adopt a Chikorita today at your nearest Pokemon laboratory. The early game is dominated by a lot of world building, a lot of introductions to new mechanics within the games, and there's quite a few new things in here. We'll come to those in a few minutes. I will say, the early game is quite slow-paced. You sort of grow into your adventure a little slower than you do in Pokémon Red and Blue, but there's nothing wrong with that. I enjoy the Sprout Tower in Violet City a lot. Basically a tower filled with Pokémon trainers who all use Bellsprout for the most part. Can seem quite tedious at face value. It all ties in with the lore of the tower itself though, which I highly recommend taking a minute or two to look into. Brilliant early training ground if you chose Cyndaquil as your starter as well. Within getting your first couple of badges, you get a good feel for the region we're playing in here. Whereas the Generation 1 games dedicated the larger chunk of their in-game resources to filling you in on the basic concepts and mechanics of the Pokemon experience, these games have those foundations already in place, so they can put more into the lore here, which is perfect for me. Very early on, we're already learning about historical towers, and ruins, and unique and mysterious Pokemon. There's definitely a few extra levels of depth in these follow-ups to the first entries. So let's talk about the region, the Johto region. It is situated right next to the Kanto region from Gen 1, separated by Mount Silver and the Indigo Plateau. So you'd imagine that there'd be some bleed over from Kanto into Johto. A lot of similarities in aesthetic and culture. That really isn't the case though. Johto is much more tranquil as a whole. It has more of a traditional, rural, countryside kind of feel to it. The architecture looks older. It's much more steeped in history and tradition. The region plants a lot of questions in your mind as you travel through it and come across the aftermath of a lot of past events. Azalea Town's connection to Slowpoke after a terrible drought. The burnt tower in Ecruteak City, the enigmatic ruins of Alph. You aren't just passing through these locations to grab your next gym badge, you're piecing together a puzzle. You're painting a picture of this region and its culture, which can be as simple or as detailed as you like really, depending on how much time you choose to give to the deeper details, because they aren't shoved in your face, but seek and you will find. You kick off your adventure in New Barktown, which is this cozy, peaceful little settlement by the sea, which is complemented really nicely by the neighbouring Cherry Grove City. They almost blend into one bigger starting location at the bottom of the map here. Going from Newbark to Cherry Grove kinda gives me the same feeling of heading into town from your home on the outskirts. And Johto is peppered with serene, easygoing vibes. That was something that made a big impression on me. There's a calmness to Johto which is really comforting for me. and it makes Gold and Silver the perfect games to fire up after a busy or stressful day. All this rural, nature-focused makeup of Johto is contrasted with a very central modern metropolis. Goldenrod City is a sucker punch of modernity right in the middle of the region. It's a sharp glimpse of what much more of the region could look like in the future if other towns continue to urbanize. It has all the hallmarks of a metropolitan location. A huge department store, a commercial radio tower, even a slightly seedy feeling underground area, where you can buy certain items you can't find elsewhere. I loved this place during my first playthrough, and I think it probably was the sharp contrast that was responsible for that. Goldenrod just seemed so full of life to me. I'd say it's the modern capital of the region. But just to the north is what you definitely consider the cultural capital of Johto. Ecruteak City is most definitely the most historically significant location in the region. The towers here hold ties to all the legendary Pokemon within Johto. And that is the iconography of Ecruteak. Legends. There's mystery hovering around the place, but also a deep culture of respect for events of the past. A mild criticism I formed while playing through Gold and Silver again was the route design within Johto. The routes are quite linear. By that I mean there aren't many environmental obstacles or mazes to navigate, which to be fair does make jumping from one location to another before you get access to the Fly HM a lot easier, but it just made the routes feel a little underdeveloped. I mean, maybe that's by design. Maybe that further plays into the peaceful, laid-back aesthetic of the Johto region by having routes that aren't quite as dynamic and filled with ledges and fences and everything else. I do love the interconnectivity of the map though, especially the earlier half of the map. When you clear the Sudowoodo that's blocking Route 36, you're presented with two pathways. The one leading north will push you on up to the next town. The one leading to the east provides this oddly rewarding moment as you piece together that you've just completed a circle. You're back in Violet City again. You've arrived back where you were a couple of towns ago. And it's such a satisfying feeling to see all those parts of the map you've visited so far suddenly snap into place in your head. I liked that a lot. The Johto region came with a lot of new mechanics. The first and probably most significant one for me personally was the day-night cycle. The game is synchronized to the real-world clock, so if you're playing these games at nighttime, it will be nighttime in-game as well. And the Pokemon encounters were different at night too. If you want a Hoot Hoot, cool, they're easy enough to encounter, but you'll need to fire up the game after 6 PM. It gave a whole new level of immersion that was just mind-blowing to me at the time, and I loved playing certain parts of the game at certain times. I recorded most of this playthrough during the day as it turned out, but I always make sure to start these games at night. I don't know why, maybe it's because the first time I played them I started in the evening, but it just feels right to me to do the first section here with Professor Elm's errand in the dark, and then go back home, put the game down for the night, and begin my proper journey in the morning. I really take the role-playing aspect of Pokemon games to a corny extreme at times. This was a game changer for me though, and it's a reason I didn't enjoy the Gen 3 titles at first, because they took this feature away again. It did pose a problem though. To keep track of the time and day, yeah, these games not only kept track of the real time by the way, but the real day of the week as well. They had to constantly be using up the battery inside the game cartridge, meaning that that battery ran dry a lot quicker than if it was just there to store a save file. And after a few years, we all lost our save data. My Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire saves are still there from 2003, but my Gold and Silver ones from just a couple of years earlier, gone forever unfortunately, so that's really sad. Was it worth it for the enjoyment I got out of it at the time though? Yeah, I'd say so. Pokemon breeding was introduced in these games. You could take two compatible Pokemon, throw them in the daycare together, and after a little while, a Pokemon egg would mysteriously appear. Just don't ask how. The fact that you could find a Ditto in the wild on the very same route of the daycare as well made it even better, because Ditto can breed with anything. As someone who brute forced through the game with only my starter as a kid, I actually don't know why I didn't use this method to breed a full team of Typhlosion. I'd have been unstoppable. Held items were added in these games, so Pokemon could now hold on to items that either boost their stats in battle, or replenish their health, or even stop them from evolving. I much prefer Bayleaf to Meganium, so I had mine holding Everstone for this playthrough. I remember grappling with a bit of a realism issue here at first, like how can a Pokemon hold something but also battle at the same time, that kind of thing. The questions we're not supposed to ask. But especially as the years have gone on, I think this was a fantastic addition. I think battling could have gotten stale very fast without them. And there's so much more as well. Shiny Pokemon were introduced in Gen 2. The friendship mechanic, which was used to evolve certain Pokemon. The Pokegear allowed you to take trainers' phone numbers. Although I would highly advise against it, you will never hear the end of certain trainers yapping about absolutely nothing interesting. Sometimes it is useful though, they can sometimes call to give you rare items. But by far my favourite mechanic introduced in Pokémon Gold and Silver were the Apricorn Balls. In Azalea Town there is a man called Kurt, and if you bring him apricorns that you'll find growing on trees around the region, he will turn them into special, very rare Pokeballs, which to this day continue to be my favourite Pokeballs in the entire series. When we do get a Johto remake or revisit, I am stockpiling 999 of each of these bad boys. The quality of life stuff isn't something to be glossed over either. Being able to simply click on a tree to use cut instead of having to manually go into your party screen every time, that was huge. Same goes for all HMs actually. The XP bar now shows you how close your Pokemon is to leveling up, the ability to reorder Pokemon moves, the ability to forget moves, oh my god what a lifesaver that was. So HMs were expanded upon in these games, unfortunately, and they added arguably the worst HM in the series, Whirlpool. It's a close one between that and Flash, but Whirlpool was just so specific and applied to what, like 2 areas in the whole game, that I am so incredibly grateful to have had the move Forgetter in Blackthorn City so that I could swap it back out for Waterfall when I was done needing it. I talked a little bit earlier about the very rich lore within the Johto region, and I feel like that almost takes the place of a regular narrative in Gold and Silver. The region's very much a place where you paint your own picture. So, much like Pokémon Red and Blue before them, the story of Gold and Silver heavily centers around the evil team, who look very familiar in these games. It's Team Rocket again. Now this is really intriguing to me, because Team Rocket were formally disbanded by Giovanni after he was defeated by Red in the Viridian City gym. This here is a faction of Team Rocket that did not want to disband though, and they are hell-bent on making contact with Giovanni to try to persuade him to come back and head up the organisation again, to recapture that former glory. And I love that you can see how much messier and disorganised they are without Giovanni. They come across as quite desperate. They're just throwing their weight around the Johto region, trying to take hold of whatever they can to further their cause. Like trying to seize control of the Slowpoke well, to gather Slowpoke tails to sell on the black market. Using radio waves to force Magikarp to evolve at the Lake of Rage, so they can bolster their Pokemon army. And eventually taking over the radio tower in Goldenrod to try and contact Giovanni more directly via radio broadcast. Speaking of which, did you know that our Discord server is named after this tower? You should definitely join and tune into some of the chat channels we have in there. Like I said, these are all very desperate actions, and a far cry from the more sophisticated setups of their hideouts back in Kanto. If I was to give a light critique, I'd say that I kinda feel like we're clearing up Red's sloppy seconds, if that makes sense. There's no big boss battle in here. There's no real payoff at the end of it all. I suppose we do fight off a couple of Team Rocket executives, but they're not big bosses. I can't remember their names even to this day, so that says everything you need to know. These games were sequels to the first ones though, so I guess it makes sense, a continuity of the things we saw in the previous games. It just, like I said, feels like I'm just sweeping past endless rocket grunts until eventually, oh, they're all defeated now? Cool, we've saved the day. It was just missing that one final big conflict. Someone who does add some significant conflict in Gold and Silver though, is our rival. Perhaps the most antagonistic rival we've had in Pokemon. So this rival can be seen peeking into the Pokemon lab right at the beginning of the game. He literally bonks us out of the way if we interact with him. Instead of receiving a starter like we do, he ends up stealing a starter Pokemon from the lab while we're out on that errand for Professor Elm. And we actually bump into and battle him as he's making his getaway. This leads to a potentially funny scenario when we arrive back at the lab to find a police officer there asking questions about the suspect, and they ask us if we caught their name. I feel like a lot of you guys won't believe me when I say this, because it's basically a meme at this point, and it's been joked about to death, but legitimately, during my first playthrough, I did actually name him ... because that's what he said his name was when we bumped into him. I actually took that at face value, thinking that if I entered anything other than ... it'd mess up the game in some way, or we wouldn't be able to progress. I actually thought we'd find out his real name somewhere further down the line. It was only when I was nearing the end of the game, and his name was still ... that I stopped and thought, that was probably the opportunity to just name our rival whatever we wanted, wasn't it? His canon name is actually Silver. He's a cold, hostile character, and he is not interested in any kind of friendly competition. Silver believes that strength and strength alone is what matters in becoming a successful Pokemon trainer. He treats Pokemon like tools, which kinda hits the same beats as Team Rocket, you might notice. Now, it wasn't canon at the time of Gold and Silver, but Silver is the son of Team Rocket boss Giovanni. And that's interesting because it reveals a quite clearly fractured relationship between the two, because Silver makes very clear his disdain for Team Rocket whenever he mentions them throughout the game. He's always nattering about how weak and pathetic they are. That is developed further in the remakes of these games, and I do plan on making a video on those too, so we'll leave that there for now until we get to that video. He's certainly a very unique rival within the series. I believe he's the only rival that physically assaults the player at a couple of points. Despite how aggressive he is throughout the game though, he does start to show the first inklings of introspection after that final battle of the base game at the end of Victory Road. And that carries across into the post-game, which we'll talk about later. Speaking of Victory Road, to get there, in typical Pokemon fashion, we have to collect 8 gym badges. And the gyms in these games are, well, there's a lot to break down. The first gym leader is Faulkner, who uses a Pidgey and a hilariously underlevel Pidgeotto, quite a simple one to defeat. In the second gym, Bugsy presents a fairly significant difficulty spike, and I like that, because let's be honest, you go into a bug gym not really expecting too much trouble, but Scyther is a handful. It's very fast, I noticed, so that gives you something to think about. The third gym in Goldenrod City, this one's kinda famous, or infamous I should say. Whitney and her Miltank caused a lot of issues for us back in the day. It's very tanky, it has a tract which can stop male Pokemon in their tracks, which was definitely a problem for 8-year-old me who doesn't want to catch girl Pokemon, man. And Rollout can sweep you away very brutally if you let too many turns roll on. See what I did there? I only just defeated her during this playthrough, thanks to a missed attack no less. So it was good to know that I still haven't gotten any better at Pokemon battling after all these years. The fourth is Morty and his ghost Pokemon. We were still very limited with ghost types back here. Misdreavus was the one new ghost type introduced in Gen 2, but disappointingly it wasn't used here. They just stuck purely with the Ghastly line. Then a point of contention arises, as after the fourth gym, you can actually battle the next 3 gyms in any order you like. Because of this, they're all very similarly leveled. My god, that was a lot of L's. And a lot of people didn't like this, because the level curve grinding to a halt like this for 3 gyms meant you were almost certain to be over-leveled by the time you reached the third one. There was no forced full-party XP share back here, so it wasn't crazy bad. Oh my god, can you imagine if we did have the XP share here? That would be a problem. If you're using different Pokemon to take down each of these gyms though, you're probably fine. Me, as a person who puts adventure above battling in Pokemon games, quite likes this. I like the opportunity to create a slightly different story during different playthroughs. Although I will admit, more often than anything else, I tend to go Cianwood, Olivine, then Mahogany. Then of course you have the Team Rocket Mahogany hideout and Goldenrod Radio Tower invasion to deal with, which is again similar in level, because you could be doing this after gaining 5, 6 or 7 badges. So you're battling Pokemon leveled in the mid-30s for a good chunk of the game. The final gym definitely brings you back down to earth with a heavy slam though. Claire uses Dragon-type Pokemon, and they really enjoy inflicting paralysis. On top of being Dragon types, which at this point were still very firmly at the top of the pile. We did get some bona fide Ice types in this generation though to help counter them, compared to Gen 1 where the Ice typing did exist, but only as a very rare secondary typing, given to a handful of Pokemon that could learn 1 or 2 Ice-type moves. I didn't really understand the need for the little side quest we get sent on after defeating Claire. She refuses to give us the gym badge until we venture into the dragon's den behind the gym and pick up a Dragon Fang. Just seemed kinda random. After all that, it's time for the Elite Four. Same venue as the Elite Four challenge in the Gen 1 games, but remodeled a bit. It has been 3 years between the events of Gen 1 and Gen 2. First up is Will, who uses Psychic types. Another type that still enjoyed a lot of dominance in these days, so a difficult opener for sure. Then Koga, the Poison type gym leader from Kanto, has earned himself a promotion to the Elite Four. Love the callback there, that was really cool. Then Bruno makes a return. He's stood firm in the Elite Four's ranks. He's a nice point of familiarity connecting these 2 generations of games. And finally, Karen, who uses the, at the time, brand new Dark type. She was the most exciting member for me, especially at the time, because Umbreon and Houndoom became instant favourites for me, and the Dark type in general has been my favourite Pokemon type since these games. After the considerable challenge that is the Elite Four of Pokémon Gold and Silver, we come to one final bout to decide our championship fate, against the famous dragon tamer, Lance. It isn't the first time we see him in Gold and Silver though. He actually helps us take down the Team Rocket hideout in Mahogany Town. He takes on a sort of mentor role in that stage of the game, as he basically directs us where to go and assigns us tasks to complete. Now we're coming up against him in the most important battle of the game, and it's difficult. Lance has not 1, not 2, but 3 Dragonite on his team. That alone makes him much harder to defeat than he was in Pokémon Red and Blue. That was my experience anyway, which makes sense because he too has made a step up from the previous games, going from Elite Four member to Champion. I found the Elite Four quite engaging in Gold and Silver, and quite tricky in ways I didn't expect. The Pokédex is another hot topic within these games. Johto added 100 new Pokemon to the 151 we already had. A chunk of those were evolutions or pre-evolutions to existing Pokemon, which were a really big deal at the time. Like, what do you mean Pikachu is actually the middle stage in its evolution line? Pichu is actually a baby Pokemon, of which there were a good few introduced in these games to further emphasize the breeding mechanic. Onix can now evolve into a huge steel snake, one of the first instances of a held item trade evolution. Eevee has more possible evolutions, helping to introduce the friendship mechanic too. Johto did add plenty of its own brand new Pokemon lines as well. The starters? Look, I'm very biased here, but they're as strong a starter trio as we'll ever get in my view. 2 new types were added in Gen 2, the Dark type and the Steel type. The Dark type was definitely needed to balance out Psychic Pokemon. I do feel like Game Freak wasn't quite sure how to handle the new Pokemon here. A common complaint among fans is that there isn't enough Johto representation in Johto. So for example, why is Faulkner using Pidgey and Pidgeotto when he could use Hoothoot and Noctowl? Why does the only new Ghost type in Johto not appear in Johto's Ghost type gym? None of the many new Bug types are used by Azalea Town's gym leader. I imagine it's probably a balancing issue, but it could have also been to maintain familiarity for returning players. It was never a big issue for me playing through Gold and Silver. What was an issue for me was the amount of Johto Pokemon that couldn't even be found in Johto. Pokemon like Slugma and Murkrow and Houndour. None of these Pokemon could be encountered during our adventures in the Johto region, which was really annoying because they're some of the coolest Pokemon in the region too. Johto Pokemon that can only be found in the post-game areas in the Kanto region. Yep, we go back to the Kanto region in the post-game of Pokémon Gold and Silver. But we're going to talk about that in the next video, which will be out next week. Or right now if you're watching more than 7 days after this video goes live. For now, let's sum things up. Pokémon Gold and Silver were kind of a toil, but an endearing toil. It's easy to look at the Johto region and say there's not much going on here, but it's learning about the rich history of the region that's the real reward for me, and soaking in the atmosphere of a place that's been shaped by so many legendary events. Are they the most exciting games in a vacuum? Probably not to most people, but the significance of them to the wider series cannot be understated. The mechanics and quality of life additions added in these games are things you just could never imagine not being in a mainline Pokemon game now. and the emphasis on lore and world building too. That's where I think these titles fit within the history of the game series. They pushed Pokemon beyond a simple monster battler, and put them on a path to something much, much deeper.